Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And Craig, I think you're going to introduce the webinar this morning.
Thank you very much, Melissa, and welcome everybody to this FTP webinar. It's one of a series of webinars, and some of you may have attended before. Those of you that have will understand the sadly can't see you, and on some occasions, sadly, you will be able to see us. But leaving aside the poor jokes, we're here to inform you, and it will be a pleasant experience. It certainly will not last more than about an hour. Then you will be able to return to your normal activities, and hopefully better informed about what's afoot. I've been told that my can you hear me, Mr.
We're suffering a little bit of slightly poor sound quality, and we've got some participants pointing that out. So I think what we're going to do is Caroline and I are going to turn off our video, and Craig, we're going to leave the floor to you and see if we can just improve the sound quality a bit.
Yes, thanks.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm sorry if you are having trouble with the reception, which sometimes happens. I hope that is a better reception. I'm not sure I'll be told if it is, in which case I'll advise what we should do from here. Welcome to this webinar, to FTP's webinar on planning reform and what's afoot. I've been told the sound quality is not good enough. So I'm going to take instructions as to what we should do. It's apparently not good enough for us. Just pause, will you forgive us? Melissa, I wonder whether you would be, are you able to be heard better than me?
Good morning again. Sorry everybody about the sound quality. It is quite, it has been quite poor. If you are able to hear me better, I think what we might do is reverse the order in which we were going to speak. So I'm going to ask Craig if you wouldn't mind turning off your camera and so on. We can hear you fine, Melissa. Well, grand. Okay, well, I'm going to tackle one of the things which I find most difficult, and I'm going to start sharing my slides with you. And so we're going to be looking at zoning together quite out of context, because of course what we had arranged was that you were going to hear a little bit about what's afoot and some of the planning proposals at the moment and what really amounts to gossip in the papers in June and so on. But no matter, I'll share my screen with you. And you are, I hope, going to get up a slide there. Okay, so what's afoot? Well, we're looking at zoning together in a time in which the government has, in quite robust terms, expressed its discontent with the current planning system. It's indicated, hasn't it, its intention in pretty strong terms to speed it up. We've had think tank work which has looked at the experience of other countries which have zoning in place, and that zoning makes planning a largely administrative process, and of course it introduces greater certainty. Now, we don't know at the moment the extent of the government's enthusiasm for radical reform, but it is clear that there is a debate about options, and the professions should not be shy to contribute to the debate and add to the sum of knowledge where we can. And so in that context, your thoughts and your experiences are of great interest, and we hope that you can find a means of expressing them through the questions. But of course, I should manage expectations. We don't pretend to have a monopoly on the answers. I'll just put up then an outline of my I'll put up an outline of my talk if I can. There we go. And if, just to say, I mean, if you've been following this debate at all, then you may have heard comparisons made to other places, other countries, other cities, Germany, for example, or New York, or Sydney, or you may have heard interesting discussions about the similarity and differences between Hong Kong and the particular context of this country and the constraints with which we operate, all of which is really interesting. But my talk does not start overseas. Instead, I look to the past. And then, as you can see in the second part of the outline, we're going to have an admittedly short section on what we know about the current proposals. And I'm going to then leave you with some thoughts about radical change and complex systems. In this country, at the beginning of the 20th century, an act was proposed and then passed to provide for the establishment of a system of town planning schemes. That was introduced in 1909, and there were amendments later in, as you can see on the slide, 1919, 25 and 32. It is really interesting to look into the background of that legislation, and we have the Hansard records for 1909. The bill was introduced for its second reading by the president of the local government board, a man I think called John Burns. And in that speech, we find an insight into what was then the impetus for change. And he brought it to life really through his own experiences. You can see that he'd been spending weekends rather, visiting unemployed works in the East End of London. Particularly, he said, in close proximity to open spaces. And if members of the House had been with me, said he could have pointed out the practical way how even close to places like West Ham Park, Hainault Forest, and close to my heart, the western portion of Epping Forest and Hackney Marshes and by the River Lee, if we'd had this bill, he said, 40 or 50 years ago, the amenities of these parks and open spaces could have been enormously added to by maintaining a balance between them and the houses built in their neighbourhood. So understanding the context is really important. What that act did was introduced a power to prepare and then to have approved, actually by, if you can see on that previous slide, the local government board to which I've already referred, a town planning scheme. All important context was that there was an absence of, unlike now, an absence of general control over development. And so what Parliament was seeking to do was to provide a means of improving the quality of development itself. It was to regulate the quality of development itself and to mitigate the effects of that development. And as you've seen very clearly from the speech which introduced it at the second reading, it was the improvement of public health and amenity. And so what of the outcome? Well, where schemes were brought into being, and more on that later, there were zones within which development could take place, but it was regulated so as to secure proper sanitary conditions, amenity and convenience in connection with the laying out and use of that land and neighbouring land. So I then posed this question in the slide. Well, was that early town planning legislation based on zoning? Well, if one thinks about the essential components of zoning, it's an ability to develop as of right, provided that the prescribed rules in place are followed. And so I would argue that, yes, that the effect of that early legislation was to introduce a control. It regulated a specific geographical area where development could take place, provided it followed those prescribed rules, and it was therefore a form of zoning. So what happened then? Well, in 1947, hello, Craig, pop it back up on the screen. In 1947, the modern system of town planning was introduced. And there too, there was an impetus for change. It was introduced to tackle what were felt to be the defects in the old system, the zoning system. There was a poor take-up. As I indicated earlier, there was a power, but not a duty to introduce town planning schemes. It was grindingly slow, and there were problems with the transitional arrangements where, for example, schemes were in production but not yet adopted or not yet approved and adopted. And then later acts you see are very preoccupied with enforcement provisions. The town planning schemes were thought to be inflexible and certainly were criticised as being out of date. And the outcome had been a patchwork of schemes with limited strategic planning between them. And so the sorts of infrastructure requirements are absolutely crucial to having functional places were, for obviously many reasons, historical, many reasons to do with the particular circumstances at that time, particularly problematic. So a zoning system, which was then replaced by our modern system of town planning based upon a plan-led system, including obviously an important component of flexibility. We turn then to what we know about the current proposals. And we can start, I think, with the January Rethinking the Planning System for the 21st Century, the January 2020 paper. Now, that espoused a binary zonal land use planning system. In broad terms, two categories of land: land where there would be a permissive approach to development subject to binding rules, and the only other category of land then land where development would be restricted. And so a much more liberalised approach to development, and importantly, that development could take place as of right in those particular areas subject to abiding by the rules as I've mentioned. But that very radical, in fact, arguably polemic paper, the proposals within it have not been picked up, certainly yet. And in the Planning for the Future document published by the government in March of 2020, that looked at the increased use, the expanded use of zoning tools which already exist, such as local development orders, which were mentioned in particular. And also, you will have seen, or you may have seen, a consultation on free ports, which is relaxation of planning controls in relation to ports, and a suggestion that you would be an allocation of 10 ports in a competition so as to radically liberalise the planning regimes in relation to those areas. So those are really all of the proposals which we've had detailed to date, which is, I would say, quite far short of the more radical reforms which are, I think, being debated. It is then coming to the end of what I want to say about zoning. It is necessary to think, in my view, it's necessary to think about the purpose of planning. As I suggest in the first bullet point on this slide, it's about resolving competing interests which are in tension, and that is an absolutely crucial task. it's a crucial task because unlike when one's dealing with other scarce resources, development on land is permanent, and so we live with our mistakes and our successes, of course. But it's also absolutely crucial because of the really pernicious effects of failing to meet social and economic needs. And I think that that is a particularly pressing concern. I would acknowledge that the creation of greater certainty within planning, firstly to attract, but also then to sustain investment, that has got to be a powerful factor in favour of reform, because for all the benefits of the flexibility of the current system, it can lack certainty, it can be unpredictable. In a sense, the flexibility means that necessarily there's an element of uncertainty in it. And the use of zoning, again, one has to acknowledge, can offer certainty, but where you have discretionary models like that patchwork model we saw in the early 20th century, that proved, even on that discretionary basis, to be slow and to be rigid. There is, in my view, clearly scope for zoning where there are few constraints. But just a couple of thoughts on that. At first, it is the case, I think, that where there's the greatest scope for zoning, where there's fewest constraints, you have the least uncertainty anyway. I mean, it may be that it may be that risk is capable of being reduced in any event, but still you are operating in a world in which there are fewer constraints and therefore greater certainty as to the likelihood of acceptability of development. But of course also, there are existing tools which offer mechanisms for zoning, such as the local development orders or permission in principle, and so on. So where you have scope for zoning anyway, you do have tools in place, and it may be that and Caroline's going to talk a little later on about permitted development rights and how they fit into this puzzle of greater liberalisation. And I leave you with this. Is it really the case that instituting radical reform, particularly in a turbulent time, to such a complex system, is that likely to speed things up in the short or medium term? I mean, I've seen really quite good thinking from planning professionals already and other lawyers who are urging that the current system be funded properly, for example, so that it continues to function for all of us. And one can certainly see that in a context in which funding is under great strain, that proposals for radical reform might have to take a back seat. But we will see, we await with interest the next stage. So I'm going to now, having shared those thoughts with you, stop that sharing. And then, Craig, I'm going to hand back to you if I can.
Thank you very much, Melissa. I hope that I can be seen and heard more clearly than before. But what I'm going to ask is if Caroline could share my slides, and I will have to ask her to change slides when I need that to be done. I'm sorry for the technical problems. I'm particularly sorry because I wanted to not only set the scene for Melissa and Caroline, but to introduce Melissa and Caroline to you. To those that know Melissa, she is well regarded in the planning law field and highly sought after as a senior junior. That won't come as any surprise to you, having heard her very lucid and informative presentation on the zonal planning system. I will now provide that context that I promised, slightly out of order, I apologise, but I hope nonetheless of interest. It has more of a political feel to it than a legal feel. First slide, please, Caroline. So before now, one might ask the question, is this all new? In one sense, nothing is really new.
political life has always included reviews of the planning system since at least 1947. Every government, when it is elected, seeks to choose sectors to review and change, and the planning sector is no different. So, for example, in 2018, the Rainsford Review on Planning was published. That included, for example, proposals to enhance the status of the local plans and to provide rationalisation on strategic planning. That, perhaps you might think, had a rather undeserved muted response from the government, but in part at least it led to and informed the changes made to planning policy at the national level. In other words, the NPPF, which of course has continued to change at least twice. A number of reforming policy provisions, some of which are very important, for example, land supply issues, have come into being. In March 2019, there was the Brokenshire statement. That was the statement that promised changes to the permitted development rights system. And then since then, we had the Conservative Party conference, where you will recall press announcements taking snippets from Mr. Jake Berry, the Minister for Local Growth and the Northern Powerhouse. And he spoke about the future of the High Street in particular. And he commented such as the state, the local government, he said, was getting in the way. He said that the planning system was out of date. And in particular, he spoke about reform to the use classes order. He wanted a position where the mortgage shop could close on a Friday and the nail bar open again on Saturday morning. So the writing was on the wall for some radical rethink, if not necessarily for any radical proposals. Robert Jenrick, Community Secretary himself, in a fringe event, spoke about getting housing into town centres. Next slide, please, Caroline. But what really made a difference in the momentum towards changes to the planning system was the report published by the Policy Exchange, that is the important independent think tank. And in January 2020, that report included a number of quite far-reaching recommendations. First, there was a proposed reform to end detailed land use allocations. In other words, to remove the systematic control on specific activities on individual land plots. Secondly, there was a proposal to introduce what was called a binary zonal land system, where land would be zoned as development land or non-development land. Within development zones, there would be a presumption in favour of development, but the zoning itself would be determined by different metrics, such as access and environmental considerations, but there would be no specific reference to specific uses. That would be left, it was proposed, to market conditions. Thirdly, local plans would be redefined. The structure and their objectives would be changed. It would be limited to a zonal map, a simple set of development control rules detailing what is not acceptable in development zones and what is acceptable in non-development zones. And there would be a focus on infrastructure provision. Importantly, there was even a suggestion that greenbelt protection would be reviewed. The fourth recommended reform related to a radical approach to the role of local politicians. It was said that as long as a proposed development doesn't break the development control rules set out in the local plan. That was all that was needed. The rest would be more of an administrative exercise of checking a proposal via its conformity with those rules. The authors of that document signed it off with this. They said that a tepid and watered down reform programme will not address the fundamental issues hampering the planning and development processes. It will only lead, they said, to more of the same. The greatest risk is not in scare stories that will inevitably emerge from opponents of planning reform. The greatest risk, it was said, is in doing nothing. Now, something in that report, perhaps in that sign-off by the authors, struck a chord in number 10. Within a month, Mr. Airy, one of the two authors, I understand, was appointed as an advisor. Next slide, please, Caroline. Now, so far as this document is concerned, this is the most formal status high document produced by the government in March 2020. So it is important. Notwithstanding its importance, it nonetheless contains what are evidently sound bites as opposed to hard proposals. So, for example, it is said, the planning process has failed to keep pace. It's complex, it's out of date, it fails to deliver enough homes where they are needed. The planning process is out of date. We will act to change this. What was referred to was an ambitious planning white paper, a planning system that works for the next century, a modernization of the system, an acceleration of planning decisions, and making things easier for communities. There was even reference to the phrase of a creation of a world-class planning service. The borrowing of that phrase, world-class, of course, we've heard in other contexts more recently. But the proposals are what need to be read. In summary, they were as follows. First, and importantly, the launching of a national brownfield map. Secondly, the reviewing of the formula for calculating local housing need. There was a proposal there for the introduction of new permitted development rights, about which Caroline will speak. There was a support for the Oxford-Cambridge ARC, including reference to a new spatial framework and up to 4 new development corporations. There was a proposal to set a new deadline fixed to December 2023. And then, of interest in the context of what Melissa has explained, there was reference to expanding the use of zoning tools, and then this important phrase, such as LDOs. So entirely flexible about what was thought to be coming forward. And later on, I'll indicate what progress has been made since March 2020, if any, in that respect. Next, it was said that there should be an improved effectiveness of CPO powers and consultation on reforms to speed up the decision-making process. And the MPPF would be revised to embed principles of good design and placemaking. There was then a section on further work, and it's that's very important in terms of the sort of radical ideas that have been debated in recent times, and a reference to a planning white paper to deliver, again, a phrase we've heard more recently, common sense planning reforms to get Britain building. Next slide, please. I put this slide here because of its chronological importance. The RTPI published this document shortly after the Policy Exchange's report, and it made 5 recommendations, but a quick glance at these will indicate that it's the view of the RTPI that such wide-reaching reforms that have been spoken about, at least in conceptual terms, are not what are proposed by the RTPI. 5 recommendations were made. First, increased funding, in particular on infrastructure and affordable housing. Secondly, more of an emphasis on decarbonisation, climate resilience, design, well-being, 21st century issues. Thirdly, leadership on digital transformation, harnessing technological innovation to make things happen more efficiently. Next, a clear direction for strategic planning on the level and scope of strategic plans. And lastly, support for a strong plan-led system. In other words, the retention of the plan-led system, but making it stronger. The emphasis being on proactive plan making, but zoning not thought to be practical or desirable. Next slide, please. And then we come to the rumour mill in June. We had the policy exchange essays that were produced, entitled Planning Anew, a collection of essays by a number of people across a range of disciplines, where each essay deals with a different part of the planning system from a different perspective. Of particular interest you might wish to read is Dame Bridget Rosewell's essay, relatively short, but it warns against the imperfections of forecasting housing needs and of the danger of local plans acting as straitjackets. There's another essay that promotes a flat tax system for affordable housing instead of the current negotiation-based approach. They're all interesting and some of them are provocative. But what is of particular interest, at least in the context of my slides, is the postscript by Mr. Jenrick. Whilst he's clear not to endorse any one of the essays or even on any one specific point, the Minister said that it's time to rethink planning from first principles. It's time for high quality design and sensitivity to the local vernacular, which must be at the very heart of the process. The time has come to speed up and simplify the country's overly bureaucratic planning process. The government is thinking boldly and creatively about the planning system to make it fit for the future. It speaks about, Mr. Jenrick spoke about ensuring that the government would act ambitiously to come to reform the planning system. I should add perhaps that the word bold, creative, ambitious can sometimes be a little disconcerting. On occasions, they can be taken to suggest that radical root and branch change is inherently a good thing, rather than making that judgment after careful consideration. An expert panel has apparently been set up to advise the government. It includes a number of people, but importantly, Dame Bridget Rosewell. Press reports have abounded and comments from others, speaking and using phraseology such as, "We must nail the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act system. The planning system must be radically liberalised. And the Minister, Christopher Pincher, has recently joined in with those statements. At the National Planning Summit, he made the point that the Planning for the Future document provided a platform for the fast track system for high quality, well-designed buildings. That's building upon what Mr. Jenrick had said about the fast track for beauty, including matters from the report from the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission. But importantly, Mr. Pincher said that there were no proposals on creating a zonal planning system. What he wanted to see was a more upfront process where it would be clearer what can be done in particular places. Next slide, please, Caroline. And so we come to the most recent event in the chronology, headed Build, Build, Build. That's a statement made by the Prime Minister yesterday. But it does raise the question, simple but perhaps important in the light of all the sound bites that emanate from the government and others, whether repetition makes a difference. Probably not. It's probably another soundbite. The truth of it is going to be measured by what the proposals are. But at this stage, the proposals are far from specific, and in some cases they are far from clear. Is there anything here that's bold, creative, or ambitious? Probably not. There's reference to the management of government-owned land. There's reference to measures to support home building. There's reference to the planning policy paper launched in July, setting out a plan for the comprehensive reform of the planning system, but no real clear view about what that paper is to include. And there's reference also to the bringing forward of a local recovery white paper and launching the National Infrastructure Plan and legislating for wider deregulatory reforms. Is there anything here really new? Not yet, but the door is certainly open for radical reform. Is there a feeling that the reform will eventually arrive is not one that in fact will be particularly bold, particularly creative, or even particularly ambitious? That is not to say, in my view, that that will necessarily be a disappointment. It has to be said that sometimes tinkering and tampering with the system, making small but significant changes, is all that's needed, and indeed the most that can be practically and politically achieved. In any event, bearing in mind the date for this document, a lot of debate is still to be had. That's all I wish to say by way of setting the context. I'm going to introduce Caroline now very briefly to you. You will know her, many of you, as a junior within Francis Taylor Building. She has already gained a properly deserved huge regard for the quality of her work, and you are very honoured to have her to inform you more about the proposals for reform in the context of permitted development rights.
Thank you very much, Craig. Can I just ask if someone can let me know if they can see my screen share?
Yes, Caroline, we can see that. Great.
Thank you very much. I hadn't anticipated having to deal with two different PowerPoints at the one time, and so I was a little anxious about getting my PowerPoint back. Okay, good. Well, moving on from Craig's overarching explanation of where we are at the moment, I think one of the only really concrete aspects of the planning reforms as they are emerging is the introduction of new permitted development rights. And broadly speaking at the moment, those are upwards extensions, the demolition of vacant and redundant commercial and residential buildings, and the rebuilding of on that plot as residential. And what we heard yesterday from the Prime Minister was a wider range of commercial buildings to be permitted to change use to residential. I have a few overarching comments, first of all. The first thing I would say, and this is really a reflection, is this seems to me to be evolution and not revolution. If we were going to have really radical reform of the planning system with the introduction of wholesale zoning across the board, it's difficult to understand why the government is, as Craig said, tinkering around with the introduction of new permitted development rights. Now, I don't suggest that permitted development rights, which are, I suppose, in effect a form of zoning, couldn't coexist with wider zoning, but the interaction between the two and the proposed future interaction between the two hasn't been explained by the government. And so that seems to me to be indicative of the proposals as they're going to turn into reality, being more of an evolution than a revolution. And I think the second point to make in that regard is when you look at the policy exchange report, there's no mention of permitted development rights. And actually, many of you will know that the permitted development rights that are now going to be introduced are aims of old. We've had consultations on both upwards extensions and demolition and rebuild on a number of occasions in the past. And so it seems to me that the introduction of these rights is really an example of cementing long-held ambitions of this government rather than any indication of radical reform. Sticking with reflections, I mean, one of the things that jumps out to me about the introduction of these new PD rights is that they demonstrate a continued commitment on the part of the government to reliance on PD for the delivery of new homes, despite criticisms of, for example, office to residential rights. So we have had liberalisation of the permitted development element of the planning system in order to deliver homes. There's been substantial and, in my view, reasonable criticisms of the way in which that's worked. And here we see there's a continued commitment to that process and that means by which new housing can be delivered. And then finally, on reflections, it seems to me that there are some competing objectives here on the part of the government. They talk about beauty and sustainability. We have the findings of the Building Better, Building Beautiful report, which really cautions against the use of permitted development rights, or at least says that they should be subject to substantial controls. And then we have this impetus for speedy housing delivery. And it's difficult to see at the moment how the two are going to coexist happily. So moving on then to the detail of the reforms. What we know now is that from the 1st of August, we will have permitted development rights that will permit 2 additional stories above existing blocks of flats. And that's in the Town and Country Planning PD Regulations 2020. So this specific permitted development right applies only to pre-existing blocks of flats, not houses at the moment. And those flats have to be built between 1948 and 2018. The host building, as in the original block of flats, has to be 3 stories or greater. The height of the extended building can't be more than 30 metres, and prior approval is required on a variety of issues. So, for example, in relation to the appearance of the building, in relation to the impact on the amenity of the existing building and on neighbouring buildings, including matters such as overlooking, privacy and loss of light, and transport and highways impacts, flooding risks, etc., etc. There's really quite a number of matters about which prior approval is required. The other thing to say about these new regulations is that they do institute some reform to the current position regarding PD rights for office to residential or, say, retail to residential. And that is that it is no longer possible to have, say, office to residential conversions that result in residential dwellings with no windows. And that is because of an inclusion in the new, in the GPDOs through these new regulations of the need for prior approval as to whether or not the permitted development would result in adequate natural light for habitable rooms. Now, I think it's difficult for anyone to argue with that, and many people have been calling on this change to be made for some considerable time. The question really is why it took so long. I suppose a few comments would be, and this is a very lawyer's comment, but what does adequate mean? Are we going to see more guidance on what the government considers adequate to consist of? And how does that play into, say, the BRE guidelines for anyone who's needed to consider those in detail? There's no there's no concrete rules. The rules are to be applied flexibly, and so how will that play into the need for adequate natural light? But I think in general, that's plainly a good and sensible move. In terms of the longer term, well, we know now, as a consequence of the Prime Minister's speech yesterday, that by September, we will have a permitted development right allowing vacant and redundant commercial buildings, including shops notably, and residential buildings to be demolished and replaced with new homes. We know that by September, we will have rights for a wider range of commercial buildings to change to residential. And we know that by September, there will be further rights to build upwards for new and bigger homes. And that was a comment in the explanatory memorandum to the new 2020 regulations regarding upwards extensions in relation to blocks of flats. But in relation to all three of these issues, we really have absolutely no detail as to how they're intended to operate. Will they be subject to prior approval? I would have thought so, but the detail of that is as yet unclear. What I would say is this, that with these new rules in place, I think our high streets and our town centres may look very different in the years to come. And I would also say that what we're seeing here from the government is a real commitment to the supply of housing and speedy or perceived speedy housing delivery, potentially at the expense of quality of new homes and at the expense of more strategic placemaking. And whether or not that produces the types of homes and the types of town centres and towns and cities that we want to see, I think remains to be seen. So there's clearly much to be worked out, and very much for the geeks amongst us to be looking to over the summer and in September to see how the detail will emerge. But with that, I will hand you back to Craig, and we'll take any questions that you have.
Thank you very much, Caroline. We have some questions and some comments. It won't surprise you. And I'll take them in order as much as we can manage in the time. David Brock has said this, not so much as a question, more of a comment. Can we talk more about the origins and purpose of the 1947 reforms? They came about as a result of the recommendations of the Afoot committee set up to look into how to ensure that post-war rebuilding would not be delayed or hindered. They were a positive planning measure, and they were underpinned by a presumption in favour of development, which itself dates back to the 1923 circular. That circular stated that the presumption should always be in favour of the person planning seeking consent. And then David continues briefly, ministers have the ability, he says, to speed up and influence planning radically within the current system, and the Secretary of State sits at the top of the planning system, see Suffolk Coastal. So the Secretary of State can use his powers on appeal and call in to deliver planning permissions, although of course, as he says, this means having the courage to take unpopular decisions. I only have two comments, and then I'd like to ask Melissa to contribute or add if she wishes. So far as the 1947 Planning Act is concerned, David, I think you're absolutely right, because my learning when I came to the planning bar started off with that important principle about a presumption in favour of development. And in very short terms, the approach to what you could do on your land was, you can do anything on your land unless there is some rule or regulation saying that you can't. So the basic presumption has always been there. So far as your second point is concerned, by reference to the Secretary of State's existing powers, you rightly refer to the powers of appeal and call-in. But it's worth also noting, I think, that the Secretary of State has for many years now had the ability to intervene in the local plan process. But of course, as we know, rarely, and indeed only recently, has the Secretary of State chosen to intervene in that way, because they are unpopular decisions. Melissa, would you like to add to comments in the context of what David is saying?
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing is I'm quite pleased to see the appropriation of the question and answers function within this platform to provide comments, and I've found those interesting. I mean, David, I know that the Afoot committee report and 1947 Act are of particular interest, and that is, I think, for good reason. I mean, the recommendations of that committee show, I think, very little anxiety about the nationalisation of development rights, and I think that probably reflects, doesn't it, that immediate wartime history within which it was those issues were considered. That presumption in favour of development, I think we have, I suppose, a reflection of that in the presumption in favour of sustainable development. But I, for one, wouldn't wish to see the qualification that's been included there dispensed with, because, of course, that the notion of sustainable development does, doesn't it, import the understanding that we've got to balance all of the relevant competing interests when making planning decisions. So it's an important qualification to that presumption. I happen to know that you, in your article on the committee and its report, mentioned that you didn't have a copy of the 1947 Act. I've got that, so if you want to get in touch directly when you see the email address on the slides, do so, and I'll send you over a copy of the Act, which is actually really interesting to look at. There was another participant commented on the way in which zoning works in Auckland, and I looked at that quite carefully. And I think what you're telling us is, or cautioning us really, is that it's unwise to assume that the determination of applications under a zoning system is necessarily going to be free from delay. And I think that's a note of caution which is proper. Timing is one factor in relation to making of investment decisions, but I think we're going to have to grapple with the fact that one of the advantages of the zoning system should be the delivery of certainty as to outcome, if not, precisely as to timing. But the questions that I would ask, having thought about it to the extent that I have, is, well, when do you get that certainty, and at what price? So, Caroline, I think there are a few questions on permitted development rights. I know we're running a bit short of time, but why don't you pick any that have struck you as most interesting, and take over from there.
Yep, thanks very much, Melissa. So what I will do is answer a question from Lydia Sadler, which is, would the roof extension PD rights apply to a purpose-built block of flats which incorporated commercial uses at ground floor? She says it would appear that they would not, as the commercial uses would not be solely ancillary to the residential occupiers. I mean, my reading of the regulations is that they solely apply to blocks of flats that don't have any other use as part of them. So it's not a mixed use building, it's simply residential blocks of flats. I suppose in principle, it seems to me that there, if upwards extensions are permitted on blocks of flats, there's no reason why they shouldn't be permitted on blocks of flats that have a commercial element at ground floor. I wonder if we might see more on that in the weeks to come, given the reference in the explanatory memorandum to upwards extensions to allow new and bigger homes more generally. And I know there was a letter from Robert Jenrick, I think, sent yesterday, which seemed to be indicating that the upwards extension PD right would be extended to buildings that are wholly commercial. So it seems to me, as a matter of principle, there's no reason why it shouldn't also apply to commercial plus Resi, but that doesn't seem to me to be the position as things stand at the moment. I think we're probably out of time unless Craig wishes to answer any further questions.
No, we've thank you, Caroline. We've had a flurry of last-minute questions, and I'm sorry that we can't deal with all of them. Some of them are by way of comment. Some of them raise really good discussion points. But I did say we'd finish in about an hour, and I intend to keep to my promise. The only comment that I would, if I may, select is that from Tim Haggard, not least because he was the one of the early posted questions. He says this: the winning slogan that chimed in the 2016 referendum was "Take Back Control." And he asks, almost rhetorically, how could this government of Leave politicians propose a planning system reform which does not increase engagement with the public and locally elected politicians? And I think it's probably wise to finish treating that as a rhetoric question, because I think it's a very important one. To answer it would take far too much time, but it is true to say that any proposals along the line of zonal planning system will indeed raise the question, well, who is in charge of the zoning? And how will that selection process be carried out? At the one end of the spectrum, it may look nothing very different from the existing local plan system, involving consultation and detailed criteria and so forth. And at the other end, the politicians at the local level could in effect be left out of it, and consultation could be short and sweet. But I would suggest that that latter course is certainly one that is vexed and would be rife with problems, including those of legal challenge on the basis of fairness and so on. Thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in, and I apologise again for the technical problems at the start, and most grateful to Melissa for stepping in to take her presentation first. If there are any burning questions that you feel we can answer helpfully, we are always available at Francis Taylor Building. Please get in touch. And may I lastly take the opportunity of reminding you that we have other webinars programmed, all of which seek to take good, interesting and topical questions. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you. Bye-bye now. Thanks, Craig.